Good morning and welcome to our Feeling Connected webinar. I'm Councillor Veronica Jones and I'm the Cabinet Member for Adult Wellbeing. I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us today. It's not only part of my portfolio as a Cabinet Member, but also a great passion of mine to ensure that those who are facing loneliness and isolation feel connected with others and can access the support they need. We have some great support in our communities and so many opportunities out there to do our very best for the people who live and work in them. It's only natural for people to want human contact, but when someone feels alone, it is much harder for them to let someone in, making them feel even more isolated. We can all feel lonely from time to time, but everyone's experience of loneliness will be different. Some people can live their lives quite happily alone, but others will not feel that way. And this is exactly why we need to talk about how they can access support, speak with people, or simply have someone listen to them and make themselves heard. We continue to face really difficult times, and that too has a different effect on people. Our response to the pandemic has had to consider that and look at all the different ways we can support everyone in our communities, our children and young people, our families, our businesses, and our elderly. There are already so many great things happening within Northumberland communities, but we are still aware of people and families that need support. This webinar brings together people from all different areas, organisations and voluntary groups that are there to support people who feel lonely and to help us understand how we too can extend that support and reach those people most in need. It now gives me great pleasure in handing over to our first speaker, Cath McEvoy Carr, Northumberland County Council's Executive Director for Adult and Children's Services. She has been pivotal in the support available via the Council and the links within our communities to provide our most vulnerable residents with the help, care and advice they need.
My name is Cath McEvoy Carr, Executive Director of Adult and Children's Services at Northumberland County Council. And as my job title suggests, I oversee all the services here at the Council that involves the health and wellbeing of adults and children in Northumberland, from our adult and children's care services and education to our community and family support offer and looking after the more vulnerable within our communities, be that your friends, your family, neighbours or the local shopkeeper, everyone matters. We have always been fortunate with the great work within our communities in Northumberland, but over the last 10 months, we have really seen what our communities are capable of and how they have all pulled together. As I am sure you know, Northumberland is unique in having rural, coastal and inner town mix of communities and how the needs of our most vulnerable residents and families differs. But despite that, support has been there for our most vulnerable residents and families in all of our communities. We've had businesses, including our taxi companies, supporting volunteers in our communities to get food and medication to the most vulnerable people, and people making safe contact with those who are on their own, and that hasn't stopped. As a council, we stood up our Northumberland Communities Together Response Hub to engage with those voluntary groups and organisations providing support, but also to help residents and families get the right support at the right time. Loneliness can have a huge effect on anyone's mental health and well-being. It can cause them to feel empty and alone, so to know someone is there for them goes a long way in helping how they feel. As we continue to feel the effects of the pandemic, our statutory support services, community groups, volunteers and organisations are still committed to tackling loneliness and isolation, which is amazing, and we as a council couldn't be more grateful for that support. So a huge thank you to those of you who have made this possible. And on that note, I now have the pleasure in introducing our guest speaker, Olivia Field. Olivia is Head of Health and Resilience Policy at the British Red Cross. Her role focuses on emergency responses, tackling loneliness and health and social care. Her experience and knowledge, I am sure, will help us to further understand what we can do within our own communities to tackle loneliness and isolation now and in the future. Olivia Field, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here today. I'm Olivia Field, the Head of Health and Resilience Policy at the British Red Cross. My team covers health and social care, emergency response, and loneliness and unwanted isolation policy, research and advocacy. I'm here today to talk about the problem of loneliness, what we know about loneliness pre-COVID and during COVID, and what we think the implications of COVID in the future might be on our social connections, as well as who's at greatest risk and what its impacts are on our communities and our public. I'm also going to draw on what we think are the solutions from the British Red Cross perspective. As part of that, I'll touch on what government's been doing at a national and a local level, as well as insights from our partners like Campaign to End Loneliness. So why does the British Red Cross care about tackling loneliness? A lot of people don't associate the Red Cross with work in the UK, let alone work around loneliness and social isolation. Well, the British Red Cross's 150 years experience delivering frontline services to support people during emergencies, connected communities and individuals are more resilient. It is often the loneliest and most isolated people who are the least able to cope and recover from an emergency. And on the other hand, it is strong support networks and strong relationships that help protect us during these moments of crisis. But we've been seeing the devastating impacts of loneliness across all of our services for decades. From the refugees and asylum seekers that we're supporting, who have been separated from their friends and families and are trying to form the meaningful connections here in the UK with difficulty, right through to the people that we're helping home from hospital who are navigating a new long-term health condition and are struggling to maintain the relationships that they once relied on to feel connected. But we also help people who have lost loved ones in emergencies, from terrorist attacks to fires. What we've learned is that personal crises and larger crises like what we're seeing today can trigger loneliness, but then the experience of loneliness itself can exacerbate that crisis. Before the COVID emergency, we estimated that about 1 in 5 UK adults regularly felt loneliness. Around 200,000 older people were estimated more than a month. And while loneliness is often thought of as an older person's issue, it can and does affect people of all ages. The ONS estimated that 11% of children often felt lonely before COVID. We know that significant life transitions and events can be key triggers of loneliness. From losing your job, retirement, the onset of a health condition, starting to care for somebody, stopping caring for somebody, unemployment, the list goes on. The barriers to meaningful connections during these moments are both practical and emotional. If you've lost your mobility, you might physically not be able to get out and socialise more, but you might have also lost your sense of identity. And when you don't have a strong connection with yourself, it's much harder to connect with other people in a meaningful way. We're increasingly understanding that having a strong sense of identity helps protect us against loneliness. We also know that experiencing discrimination, feeling as though you don't belong to your community, can often lead to loneliness. There is a wealth of evidence to show that loneliness isn't good for our health, our well-being, our productivity, and our resilience. Feeling lonely often has been linked to a whole range of health conditions, from Alzheimer's to stroke to sleep problems, depression. The list really does go on and on. People who are often lonely have a lower self-esteem, and they're much more likely to attend A&E, go to their GP, stay in local authority residential funded care, perform poorly at school, become unemployed, perform poorly at work, and struggle with mental health. Loneliness isn't new, but we do increasingly recognise it as a pressing public health issue that we must do something about. But while loneliness was an issue before the pandemic, our daily interaction with loved ones and friends and colleagues have changed in unprecedented ways. We've stopped seeing our loved ones in person, we stopped hugging them, we stopped going to work, going to school. And while isolation isn't always a bad thing and is different from loneliness, prolonged and unwanted isolation isn't good. We are now faced with higher levels of unemployment, grief, bereavement, mental health, uncertainty. All of these things are well-known triggers of loneliness. This is why the British Red Cross has been exploring the impact of the pandemic on loneliness so that we can improve our services and encourage others to improve theirs as well throughout the pandemic. We published 2 reports since the pandemic started. The first was published right at the end of the initial first national lockdown, but it explored people's experiences during that lockdown. It's called Life After Lockdown, and it collated polling, insights and service evaluations recently gathered by the British Red Cross, interviews and focus groups. We found that a lack of meaningful contact, the stress and uncertainty associated with the pandemic, financial worries and hardship, as well as a lack of formal and informal care and support, had made loneliness worse for many. For others, digital exclusion had not only prevented them from accessing important health and safety information, 41% of adults reported feeling lonelier since the lockdown began, and a third felt that their loneliness would only continue to get worse. But these troubling figures skyrocketed for certain communities. 41% of respondents from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background feared their loneliness would continue to get worse. Almost 50% of adults with children below the age of 5 reported feeling that they didn't have anyone to turn to in a crisis, compared to about a third of the wider population. And almost 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds thought that their loneliness would continue to get worse. This report shone a spotlight on some of the communities particularly at risk of being left behind in early summer and during the initial lockdown. People who lived alone, had been shielding, those living with young children, people from a BAME background, younger people, people seeking asylum, people living with a long-term physical and mental health condition, and others experiencing hardship. We warned at that point that without concerted efforts to tackle the issue, although social distancing and lockdown measures at the time were easing, a significant cohort of the population was still very lonely and were at risk of being left behind. More recently, we published Lonely and Left Behind, a joint research study with Britain Thinks that followed 16 people over the whole month of August who had been shielding and isolating, and then contextualized these findings with polling of a nationally representative sample of 2,000. It found that the temporary easing of lockdown measures in parts of the country over the summer period actually brought new challenges which exacerbated loneliness for certain communities. At this point in time, people living alone, living with a disability, and younger people aged 18 to 24-year-olds seemed to be at particular risk of loneliness. Some people had to confront the reality of losing their jobs, the uncertainty that the future held, and those who were still isolating, of which there were many, felt particularly alone. 2/5 of UK adults told us that avoiding socialising had made them feel left behind. Even for those who had started to venture out over the summer period, indoor activities had often felt out of bounds, and they were very aware that winter was now approaching and outdoor activities were already starting to feel less attainable. And as they saw cases of COVID-19 getting higher again, feelings of uncertainty, fear, and hopelessness were starting to increase quite dramatically. We found that ultimately too many people in the UK lack strong support networks. Almost 40% of UK adults told us that they hadn't had a meaningful conversation within a fortnight and an exceptionally worrying third worried something might happen to them and no one would notice. We also found that people typically don't know how to support themselves to feel less lonely. Previous Red Cross research has found this as well. When we feel lonely, we A, often don't recognise that feeling in ourselves, and we B, don't know what to do about it when we do. But also people lack the confidence and actually feel ashamed to reach out for support, whether that support is from friends and families or a more formal service from a local government or the voluntary sector. Yet the limited coping mechanisms that people felt they once had to protect themselves against loneliness, such as seeing friends, going to work, have felt largely unattainable since lockdown began in March. The people interviewed in this study spoke about trying to distract themselves from their feelings of loneliness by watching TV or reading a book, but reflected that after such a long period of time of isolation, these coping mechanisms were no longer working. Others tried to latch on to events or occasions that they were excited about, but then this had the knock-on effect of feeling even lonelier when these didn't materialise in practice because of new restrictions. What we're most worried about at the Red Cross, though, is that lonely people typically don't feel as though that they can cope with the crisis, and they're worried about their ability to recover altogether. There's been a sharp rise since our polling back in May of people who feel too lonely to cope. And 2 in 5 people have told us that loneliness is having a negative impact on their mental health. Feeling despondent came out very strongly in our qualitative research. And we saw examples of people feeling lonely leading to bad habits, like detaching from others even when they had the opportunity to connect, right through to not exercising and bad eating habits. At the Red Cross, we've been particularly concerned about those people who have effectively never stopped shielding, really, since the pandemic began, even when the rules allowed it. Despite restrictions easing over the summer, some people have never felt comfortable leaving their homes or having visitors. Watching others resume their lives made these people feel particularly left behind. We've often spoken throughout the pandemic about a rise in neighbourliness and community spirit. And at the Red Cross, we witnessed that ourselves at the beginning, first few weeks and first few months of this pandemic. People, our service users, told us for the first time they got to know their neighbours, they waved at their neighbours, they smiled at their neighbours, they got letters through the postbox from their neighbours. Some of these people have been housebound for a long time and never felt connected to them before. But our research has found that this neighbourliness and community spirit has actually dropped off over the period of the pandemic, especially as restrictions started to ease over the summer period. People who were still shielding and isolating felt that the people who could see people in person, albeit from a distance, no longer wanted to talk to them over the phone or online. People were also just generally feeling much more exhausted and bored and fed up with it all. And this in turn lowered their mood and made it much harder to connect with people at all, even when they had the opportunity. And when they did connect with people, they found that they just weren't satisfied with these conversations and connections because they just felt so low. Many people who've been shielding have also felt burdened or troubled about choice. Describing situations of constantly, asking themselves, should I leave the house or shouldn't? Should I see people or not? Should I go back to work or not? Should I go to the supermarket or not? In some cases, they also felt resentment as they watched others return to a normality they didn't yet feel comfortable with. Ultimately, as the rules became complicated, so did our relationships. So what can we do about it? In light of all of this, it's more important than ever to tackle loneliness. And while not perfect, we've learned that it is possible to support ourselves and to support other people, even from a distance. Generally, people who are lonely are much less enthusiastic about any solutions posed to them, but not entirely. The important thing to remember when thinking about solutions is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for one person might not work for another. Our qualitative research actually found that mental health and emotional support might be the most helpful intervention going forward. Many of our research participants actually found that taking part in the research itself really helped them cope with their feelings of loneliness and come to terms with it and start to be proactive in thinking about solutions. And that's because they got to speak quite regularly about how they felt and how loneliness was impacting their day-to-day lives. And they noted that recording their feelings in a diary was particularly helpful. Here are a few insights from our polling as well. One thing to press is that too many people don't know how to access support, and they feel too uncomfortable talking about it and reaching out for the help that they need. Our research participants and polling respondents identified relatively simple things which could help. Speaking to friends and family over the phone or over Zoom. Our research carried out a few months ago also found that really simple things like receiving a text message and even reading about positive stories could help. Linked to that, trying to think positively is a really effective way to protect yourself against loneliness, though of course that isn't always easy to do. I encourage everyone who hasn't yet to read the Campaign to End Loneliness's report, The Psychology of Loneliness, which identifies interventions like cognitive therapy right through to mindfulness as protective factors against loneliness. And we know that staying stimulated too can make a big difference. Ultimately, when we feel better about ourselves, we find it easier to connect with other people in a meaningful way. The big message is that small things can make a big difference. At the Red Cross, we've been strong advocates for the rollout of social prescribing for a long, long time. It's basically what we've been doing for decades, working with the NHS and local authorities. We think people's needs are hardly ever only clinical. Non-clinical needs, such as loneliness, really matter. Over the COVID period, it's been great to see how many voluntary and community sector organisations, local government services and health bodies have adapted their schemes despite financial pressures and restrictions up and down the country. Community activities are now online, one-to-one support has been provided on people's doorsteps and over the phone. It's really amazing how quickly so many organisations have innovated to continue to help people who are feeling lonely. At the Red Cross, we've adapted our social prescribing services too, so that we can continue to support people despite measures and other pressures. These schemes provide one-to-one tailored practical and emotional support, usually for a period of about 3 months. We help people understand what it is that has made them feel disconnected and help them grow their confidence so that we can ultimately reconnect them to their communities, whether that be to an online course, to a new job, to friends and families who they've felt disconnected from, right through to a local club. Before COVID, these schemes helped about 2/3 of people feel less lonely. Interestingly, the biggest impact was felt amongst those who were considered the loneliest, according to the UCLA official recommended measure of loneliness. We know that people who have felt lonely for a long period of time usually need a period of one-to-one confidence building support before they're ready to reintegrate into society or reconnect with friends. To help people do this, we usually co-create small, achievable goals to work towards feeling ready to reintegrate. And to explain that, post-COVID, pre-COVID, sometimes we would help people who'd been housebound for years, who really were not motivated, did not want to reconnect with their society. We'd get to know the individual, and we'd start with really simple things sometimes, like opening the curtains one week, opening the window the next, walking together to the front garden gate the next, going to the bus stop the next, ultimately trying to work towards what it is that they want to make them happy in the longer term. Throughout the COVID period, we've been helping people online, over the phone, but we've also been doing new things like delivering well-being packages, which might include everything from at-home exercises, puzzles that they know other people are doing at the same time, to health and safety information. In some parts of the country, we've even been providing plants for people to nurture and have something to look after. We've also done other things to support people, like set up a coronavirus support line. Having someone to talk to, even over the phone, and look to for information and advice has helped people feel more connected and less alone. We know that people ultimately miss face-to-face interaction, and face-to-face interaction should really be prioritised going forward. We shouldn't see online substitute these types of interactions after COVID. But ultimately, what matters most is one-to-one conversations, tailored support and choice. In this context, accessing the internet or phone data and learning how to use these technological devices in the first place is incredibly important and absolutely devastating for people who don't have access to these privileges. That's why we've partnered with government departments such as DCMS and the Home Office and corporate partners like Vodafone and Tesco to provide people who are lacking devices with devices, who can't afford them, and also upskill people who don't know how to use them or lack the motivation and confidence to. But of course, social prescribing is just one piece of the puzzle. The Campaign to End Loneliness recently revisited their Promising Approaches framework, which I encourage everyone to read, and has really helped the sector understand their part in tackling loneliness in the loneliness ecosystem. The framework helps to make sense of different ways we can address loneliness and explains how these approaches all fit together to create an effective community response. Connector services, including the one that I just described, like social prescribing, are needed to support people who are already lonely to engage with their communities. They're often focused on supporting somebody to overcome the practical and emotional barriers that are preventing them from engaging with those around them. And they often, again, focus on growing people's confidence and sense of independence. They often link people to direct solutions, which are the groups and activities that are most readily recognised as loneliness interventions, such as lunch clubs, sports activities, arts and crafts groups. Gateway infrastructure enables people to connect. We've seen the importance of digital technology during COVID, and pre and post-COVID transport and the built environment needs to be accessible and designed in a way that helps connect communities. Frustratingly though, our gateway infrastructure is all too often unavailable, inappropriate, and inaccessible. And finally, system-level approaches create the right environment in communities to tackle loneliness. They usually have to underpin any effective community response. And they include stuff like good volunteering network and asset-based community development. But while local places have to be at the heart of any approach to tackle loneliness, much of this local work is facilitated and also hindered by national policy and practice. In recent years, we've seen a real shift amongst employers, government, and others in their understanding and attitudes about loneliness. A lot of this work that we've seen over the last few years stems back from work that we did as part of the Jo Cox Commission on Loneliness, which throughout 2017 set out to do a really simple thing: just start a national conversation about loneliness, show that anyone can be lonely, and it's also in everyone's interest to tackle it. To do this, we shone a spotlight on a whole range of people's experiences of loneliness, from refugees to carers, and ended the year publishing a mini manifesto calling on government and others to do 3 key things: ensure national leadership, including appointing a minister and developing a strategy; improve the evidence base, including recommending a standard way to measure loneliness; and invest in research studies to better understand what works. And finally, we called on them to catalyse action through funding. Since then, we've seen positive progress against each of these 3 strands, and now have national cross-government efforts in England, Wales and Scotland. In England, government strategy, which was published in 2018, committed to an impressive 60 policy and practice changes across 9 government departments. It included the rollout of NHS England's social prescribing link workers, to introducing loneliness as part of the new relationship, sex and health education in schools, in primary and secondary schools. And it invested in a campaign called Let's Talk Loneliness to tackle the stigma associated with the issue. I could, of course, list all 60, but you can equally look at the strategy yourself if you haven't already. These are very welcome, but these efforts are really just laying the foundations for change. To truly tackle the issue, we have a lot more to learn, and we need sustained action at every level, especially now. The Red Cross provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Loneliness, alongside our partner, the Co-op. We've been carrying out an inquiry into what needs to happen next, in particular what government needs to do next to tackle the issue. And we've identified 4 key areas to focus on. The first is how to design and implement ways to test the implications of government policy and practice. We've heard from many over the years that actually one of the best ways national government can support tackling loneliness efforts is by not making it harder to tackle loneliness on the ground through unforeseen consequences of policy and practice. We've also been exploring how to translate these national efforts and the national strategy into local action through local authorities and their partners. And we've been exploring the importance of community infrastructure, including housing, transport, and public spaces. And finally, we've been trying to solve the issue, to try and work out how to adequately fund the voluntary and community sector, upon which social prescribing ultimately depends. Not surprisingly, hundreds of respondents have told us about the need for central government to better support local authorities financially to protect the physical places we rely on to connect, and to support them and other local partners to loneliness-proof our infrastructure so that it's planned and designed in a way that fosters rather than hinders connections. Simple things like putting more benches into parks and ensuring public toilets are clean and available, right through to including warm and more intimate lighting in apartment block corridors, to designing in communal spaces into residential and workplaces, can make a big difference to how communities connect with each other. But in the immediate term, to stop the situation getting worse during COVID, and in particular to stop the loneliest becoming lonelier and these feelings becoming even more entrenched than they already are, the Red Cross is calling for several things. First, we want civil society organisations like ourselves to continue to tackle loneliness, share learning, and importantly, prioritise those most at risk. Going forward, we need to be working with our local partners like local government to design solutions directly with people with lived experience that feel safe, but also remain effective. We've been calling on governments across the 4 nations to launch a plan to tackle loneliness this winter, from a campaign focused on promoting alternative ways to connect, to including wraparound support, including with loneliness, for anyone being advised to shield or self-isolate, or in receipt of other government support such as food. We've also been calling on government to support local authorities and health bodies to better identify and address those most at risk of loneliness through dedicated funding and guidance going forward. And of course, we need to see continued efforts to tackle digital isolation. After COVID, this issue is still going to be very, very troubling for many people across society. And we've been really pleased to see England and Scotland in particular take steps towards some of those policy calls. But we're also calling on governments to do much more to ensure those most at risk of loneliness are able to access the mental health and emotional support they need to cope and recover from the crisis. Of course, enabling this requires local systems to have the capacity, resources, and skills to meet the increased demand. And in the medium to longer term, we're calling on governments to support local places to create and deliver multidisciplinary COVID recovery plans to tackle loneliness. This should include plans to tackle loneliness amongst those most impacted by the COVID crisis and most at risk of loneliness. It should include plans to tackle the underlying causes of loneliness, such as financial hardship. It should look to invest in reintegration and confidence building support. And we should ensure our social spaces and transport foster connections going forward. Thank you.
So hi, welcome to the discussion part of the panel discussion part of the webinar. I'm fortunate to be joined by 5 esteemed guests who are prominent actors in the field of loneliness and social isolation and are delivering inspiring work across the region. We have with us Amy White, Freya Usman, Jane Pennell, Liz Prudhoe and Tom Bradley. So thank you guys for giving up your time to join us here. We'll be using this session to go through questions that were submitted to us online, which will be covering a broad range of topics. So thank you to everybody who sent one in. There were a lot of questions submitted, so apologies if we don't have time to go through yours. It's just merely time management. So now if the panel members would like to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their work, that'd be great. Amy, would you like to start us off?
I will, no problem at all. So I'm Amy White and I'm Head of Charitable Services for Age UK Northumberland. Age UK Northumberland is an independent charity covering the county. So whilst we're linked to the national charity, we are independent and therefore have to raise our own money to be able to provide the services that we do. And we support anybody over the age of 50 across the county to live the best lives that they can. And that's everything from supporting them with information and advice, advocacy, health and wellbeing, and also things like domiciliary care. We've got a team of carers that actually go into the community and provide care in the homes, which has certainly been challenging over this last 10 months for us all, to be able to continue to provide the services that we do, but in a slightly more remote way to the way that we historically did do it.
Sounds great. How about you, Freya?
Hello everyone, my name is Freya Usman and I'm the founder of a small charity called Being Women. We are based in Ashington, Northumberland, but we do cover the areas of Bedlington, Blyth and Linemouth and other surrounding areas. What we do is we work towards promoting equality, diversity and inclusion in the region with a focus on tech skills and delivering tech skills as well, along with the domestic abuse services and mental health services. Majority of our service users are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, including asylum seekers and refugees. Though we build, what we aim for is that we would like to build a fair and inclusive society where everyone is welcomed to not only gain digital skills, which is quite like an important thing at the moment during COVID, but also to be who they are and just promote mainly the equality and diverse communities in Northumberland.
Sounds like incredible work. How about yourself, Jane?
Jane Pennell. I work in the north of the county. I used to work in local government, and since retirement, I describe myself as a community activist. So I run North Northumberland Voluntary Forum. I chair that. I work with Glendale Connect, which is a group trying to connect up people in the Glendale area. And even more locally than that, I coordinate efforts across 3 parishes, keeping Louwican district connected. So it's all that connectedness, trying to enable people to meet up and to get organisations together to partner.
Great. On to you, Liz, please.
Hi, my name's Liz Prudhoe. I'm director of a charity called Adapt, which is based in West Northumberland, but also has a base in Pegswood. We work across the country. I think where our story, I suppose, was very much as a small community group, which was established a bit like Being Women. I think it was established in 1991. And we've developed over that period of time to now we're a sort of sizable social enterprise. We deliver a range of contracts which are Northumberland wide, and we have our own site and we provide the statutory advocacy across the county. We host Health Watch Northumberland, we host the social prescribing for West Northumberland, and on our site we have a community cafe. So I think things just grow really, and the charity's aim is to promote an inclusive society as much, and to support. Its primary aim is to support disabled people and people disadvantaged by rural location.
Wonderful. And finally, on to yourself, Tom.
Morning. My name is Tom Bradley, and I work for Community and Voluntary Action Blyth Valley. I'm the Chief Executive. And we are supporting a range of voluntary community organisations here in the southeast part of Northumberland, and a lot of that has been disrupted and has had to change and adapt to be able to offer support and services to the local members of their communities. That's taken a number of different mechanisms to do that. People extending their services, engaging more volunteers as part of that, and we've linked back to the Northumberland Communities Together team to be able to do that more successfully than I think any of us would have been able to do individually.
Great, that sounds like phenomenal work. So let's dive right into the questions. So the first question is, we had a pandemic of loneliness before COVID-19 came along. Would the panel members agree with this statement? And what do you see as the biggest hurdles to overcoming loneliness and isolation? Jane, would you like to start on that one?
Yes, loneliness has been with us for a long time, and we all know that, but the pandemic has definitely deepened it, so that people who were already lonely are lonelier, and more people feel lonely because their traditional connections, and particularly, you know, Christmas is only one point in the year, but it kind of highlighted, I think, for a lot of people, they couldn't talk to relatives, there's a newborn in the family, they can't cuddle, all kinds of isolation, and those restrictions have really made a difference. And I think there's an increased profile to loneliness. We talk about it more, it appears in the media, and I guess if you're feeling isolated and lonely, having other people talking about it can be positive and negative. I think that the biggest hurdles we've got are physical. We have a dispersed and sparse population outside of the southeast of the county, and that's a real issue for people. It's cultural because there's a fierce independence amongst some of, particularly our older folk, who are used to getting on with things and solving their own problems, or maybe going to a neighbour, and now that's just not available to them. There's a virtual barrier. The hurdle of lack of broadband, lack of being able to use a mobile phone. Just for reference, if I need to use my mobile phone, I have to go down the back end of the garden and stand on a bench. I don't do that very often. And there's a lack of skills that people have, so they don't know what to do with the kit that they maybe have. And I think, and this is an important one, there's an emotional hurdle. There's a real fear around, and feeling people who've been kind of managing quite well in their lives suddenly feel that they're failing, and that failure is a hard one to overcome. Now, and I think there's a lack of understanding about solutions as well. I give you fair warning that I'm an advocate of asset-based community development, ABCD. And I think that there's no point in trying to helicopter in a solution from somewhere on high and visit it upon a population or a small settlement. The real solution lies in looking at what there is within the community, using emotional intelligence to understand what the things that people are going through, and talking to them, listening to them about the kinds of things they want to do. The kinds of connections that they need to make, and then helping them to develop a solution. And that way we can begin to develop something that's sustainable. But it's going to be a slow process. This isn't something that's going to suddenly happen overnight, because I think that a lot of organisations, a lot of statutory bodies feel that they must get in there and do something. But actually, to make it sustainable, I think it has to start with communities and with individuals themselves. So that's my bit.
That's great. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add on to that?
I totally agree with Jane. I mean, I think what she's just said kind of rings true as to how we've all had to deal with this pandemic. I mean, the one thing that we learned was the only way that we can have an impact across the county is pulling together as a community. We can't, I don't think any of us can be the one-stop solution. But the one positive that's come out of this is the way the community has pulled together. It's really, it really has been testament to the relationships that have been built, and the way that, the local parishes have worked so proactively in across the county. And when we've been trying to get out there to be able to provide support for those that are isolated, the solution wasn't for us to just send a team of our personal volunteers out. It was to work with those communities to be able to have that impact, so that it can be sustainable to go through this. Otherwise, it would have all come crashing down within the first couple of months. We wouldn't have managed to go ahead through this 10-month period that we've got right now, and also the pandemic that we're going to have to face, which is the one coming out of this whole crisis, and how we're going to be able to support people coming through it. So I 100% agree with Jane.
Great. All right, we'll move on. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just kind of what the actual question talked or referenced about that there was previously a pandemic of loneliness. And if we're talking pandemic, then we're talking global. And actually, I think if we look around the world, there are societies and communities that do look after their isolated and vulnerable people much better than maybe we have done in this country over recent years. So there may be lessons to be learned from other areas, other cultures, other communities that actually we could do better by looking at and learning from. I think that when we are able to offer services and be able to support more, as well as people being isolated at the moment, they're isolated and frightened. I think whatever we're looking to provide and whatever we're looking to do moving forward, we need to be very sure about that we are demonstrating safe practices and that people are reassured that whatever measures are either recommended, required in the guidance, that we are doing that to support people so that they have confidence in engaging and re-engaging back out with friends, family, communities.
Yeah, sounds good. So for the second question, Jane, something you touched on in your answer actually for the previous question. So this question is social isolation and the issues associated with it increasing, or is it that we speak about it more and are therefore more increasing awareness of it? Freya, would you like to start on that one?
I think yes, because what I agree with Jane is that, you know, everyone's isolation is different, Alex. I might feel isolated in a different way. The people who are from different cultures, because obviously we work with ethnically diverse people, their isolation was far higher before pandemic as well. Because of the language barriers, because of immigration statuses, because of lack of awareness, because lack of cultural awareness in Northumberland as well. So they were already very isolated. As Jane was mentioning, Christmas has been such a wonderful year for most of us, and unfortunately, we were not able to celebrate it in the same way the people who were Muslims, they couldn't celebrate it in the first lockdown. And the Eid, they could not celebrate it. It was a very, very big thing for the Muslim community. Then came Diwali, they could not celebrate that. Whereas, so you can understand that it has affected every community in its own way. And the way, yes, I would agree with Jean and everybody here that it affects in both ways. It can be positive, it can be negative as well, the more we speak about it. Because sometimes it's like, why people are feeling a bit uncomfortable now speaking about their isolation. They just do not want to share how they are feeling because they've got so many other issues apart from isolation. They have got unemployment issues, lack of financials, you know, lack of understanding, especially this digital divide that has come in. Not everybody knows how to operate or come on a Zoom session. So a woman who's coming from maybe Iran, never been to school, how would you expect her to communicate with a doctor on a Zoom call? Secondly, if there is digital poverty where people have to choose between food and data, how can you expect people to come on to Zoom calls to access, to attend sessions? So there's a lot more than isolation. So isolation is I would say that it is very much categorized in very various ways, but I do agree with you that yes, if we speak more about it, if we come together as a community, it can be, it's going to be a slow process, but I see from my experience, I've seen that the way Northumberland communities together has come in, the way communities have come together, it has shown the rest of the Northeast how diverse, inclusive, and equal Northumberland is. They have worked tremendously hard, and what I've really appreciated and what Being Women has really seen, though as a very small charity, we would not have been able to do anything if there was no support from the other communities. So there was not like a rush on who's doing what and who's doing best. It was more about we are working together. And I think as a community, what I've seen come out of COVID is we all have realized as a community, we are stronger together. We can't build our own pots in isolation. We have to be together and be more sympathetic, be more understanding, and be more empathetic about our own situation on a human level.
Great. Does anybody else have anything they want to say to that? Or
Yeah, I would very much agree with everything that's just been said, but I would also, I think there was a key point there about Northumberland communities together. I think that was the difference, I think, because whilst lots of organisations might be working county-wide, it is who's got the data and who knows where everyone is and who can pull that together. And I think that's going to be crucial for anything going forward, because I think the evidence has been proven that people will work together and in right across the spectrum, whether that's COVID groups, whether it's parish councils, whether it's voluntary organisations. But it does take, not everybody's got the answer. So that's going to be one of the key things, I think, going out of the pandemic.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I was just going to say the nature of the rurality that we're having to face, I think, has had a big impact as well. So I think as a county, you know, we've got such a diverse range of, you know, villages and towns around there that we've got to address. And I think, you know, working together has been kind of key. But nobody starts out being isolated and lonely. I think that's the one thing that everybody, you know, it's something that manifests over a period of time. You know, you start off living that dream life in your country house in the middle of nowhere, and then you end up alone by yourself, or even lonely, you know, the children fly the nest and go to work elsewhere. And I think it's that realization of what gets us to that point, you know, as to, you know, people's pride. They don't talk about how lonely they're feeling. But I think maybe the one thing that's come out of the pandemic is some people are talking a little bit more about it. But you know, it's not something that anybody starts off with. I think it's something that does manifest over a period.
And I think particularly when people, they retire into the area, either because they're living here anyway, or they come as retirees, and they're well in their health and in their finance and in their social connectivity and all those kinds of things. And then those things diminish, and they actually end up with potentially a fair amount of poverty in health, poverty in finance, poverty in connectivity. And so it becomes a kind of a more and more isolating condition, doesn't it?
But I would also say, though, I think loneliness goes right across the spectrum. I think it goes from, you know, young mothers, young children, young people, right the way through. And I think it's what is the answer for different people? It will be different things. And I think, but I think we've also got to remember that there is a lot of connectivity. There's a lot of family connectivity. There are a lot of people who have good support networks. So it's about finding out that balance and finding out how that can reach out that little bit more. It might not always need an intervention of, you know, the local authority or a voluntary organisation. It may be just that people reach out to each other, as it was seen, I think, originally from the first lockdown. I think this lockdown's been a bit different.
I think as well, you know, and it's a bit where Amy was mentioning about families are much more distributed than they ever have been before through social mobility. So your family might be in a different part of the country where that wasn't really the case 50 years ago. But I think the mechanisms in the ways in which people can be supported have changed and are changing. So, for example, somebody who's living in another part of the country could arrange and order a delivery from their local supermarket or from the local restaurant back to a family member. So there are different ways in which people can be supported and can be looked after, but you know, we need to really examine all of these mechanisms and make the best use of them all. Looking at Jane's point about asset-based community development, a number of years ago there was a lot of club and institute unions that were established to support family members, to support communities, particularly in the mining areas. They became known as working men's clubs and became a bit more isolating for the women members of the local community, the female members of the local community. But I think there's ways in which we could look back at the origins of that, about how that was intended to support the whole of the local community and make use of those assets better than they have been over the last few decades.
Carrying on from the points in those answers then about the different aspects that can affect loneliness, one question we had was, do we have a sense that this issue has an inequalities angle, or is social isolation felt by people irrespective of their socio-economic status or other inequality dimensions? Liz, would you like to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I do think there is an element to equality around it, because I think and some of the things that Jane and was saying there, I think if you don't have enough income and you don't have enough support around you, sort of financial support and housing support, you will be more isolated, and social isolation is going to be worse. So there is a bit around that, and I think if you looked at figures, I think that would show to you, the evidence would prove that people who are less able to, you know, who don't have concrete housing, if you like, who don't have security of housing, who don't have employment, who don't have enough finances, they will feel worse, they will be more isolated. And I think it's also, you know, I was just looking at what Mind's saying. Mind are quite clear that, you know, if you're isolated, if you're feeling socially isolated and lonely, you know, your mental health is going to be worse because of that. And then I think it just becomes a bit of a vicious circle, really, and something quite hard to get out of, because I think if you've got low mood and you're feeling isolated and lonely, it's more difficult to put yourself forward for things, because your confidence is gone, your own ability to move forward. So I do think all of those environmental factors do impact.
So carrying on the kind of thoughts from it affecting different groups differently. Next question we have is, isolation is often only thought about in connection with the elderly. However, there are now many children who, because of lockdown, are isolated at home. What do you think could be done to help these children? Tom, would you like to kick us off on that one?
I think there have been initiatives around the county in the past that have been supporting young people who have lacked that confidence. One example would be a voluntary organisation, a charitable organisation, The Place to Be, that worked through a number of schools in the area. And I don't think they're either that's active in Northumberland at the moment, but there have been mechanisms and systems where schools and the community have worked well previously, and I think there may be things to go back to and look at that. I think there will be, again, opportunities for young people especially, to be less isolated through some of the physical activities that might be available to offer. That is a way that people can be encouraged and supported to be healthier, but also to be engaging with other people around them. And I did have a final point, third point on this. I think that there is an issue with the family members and supporting children in being less isolated. I think parents and grandparents are scared for their children's safety, and the children and young people might want to be able to engage and to be more sociable and engaging with their friends and other members of their families, but they may be held back by the insecurities and the fears of other family members. So I think we need to, again, it's a whole family approach that we need to be adopting.
Okay, interesting. So we had another question around children and young people, and this one is, what provision is available for young adults with disabilities in their families who may not be on any radar, such as the mental health teams, once they leave school? Does anybody want to start us off with that one?
I would start, and sorry, Jane, I would just start and say that young people there should be a transition process from children's to adult services, and therefore when the young people are being assessed for adult services, they will get a Care Act assessment, and legally they're entitled to advocacy under Care Act. So the local authority has a duty to provide that and offer that, and obviously that provision is there. So I think I think it's worth considering, should the young people be offered advocacy at the point of the transition? Should that be, a discussion with children's services to say, at this point, there should be some independent support put in there? Because I think sometimes what you can see is that a young person's views and wishes and ambitions can be different to that of a parent. And I think that can, you know, that should be, that support should start really initially at the point of transition. So that would be my take on that. I think that there is advocacy when people have an assessment under the Care Act, and any young person going into adult services would have to have that assessment. So there is an option of advocacy there, but it's to consider, should there be something a bit earlier to support young people?
And I think that there's a real gap here, but I think that the solution lies in helping people to mutually support one another into a future. And whilst I haven't got an example of the particular group you're talking about, I've got a parallel one which I thought might be useful. Here in the North, we're working on something that is going to be called Without Limits. And it's emerged directly from a service user and a social prescribing link worker working together and identifying a need. So it's going to be for 35 to 65-year-olds who are facing life-changing health diagnoses. So they have a stroke, they have early Parkinson's, they have early onset dementia. The existing provision for those groups of people is kind of carpet bowls in a warm room somewhere. The last thing that somebody aged 35 to 65 at the early stage of these conditions is going to find satisfying. So we're, through Voluntary Forum, we're umbrellaing this with Rural Us, one of our schemes supporting it. And the plan is for largely social activities, maybe a bit of Zumba, maybe some peer support, some exploring activities, going out for a meal together, but building a cohort of people who can mutually support and enabling people to live the best lives that they can, given all their conditions. And we're currently bidding for some funding to make that happen, because again, it's not something that's going to happen for free. So it's a parallel. It's again asset-based community development, and it's working with people where they are and allowing them to articulate what their need is, and then joining up with other people like them. So I think it's the kind of model that can be applied to the group of people that you're talking about.
Right, that's really interesting. Sounds like a great project. So the next question, it kind of moves us from children and young people into the elderly. So this question is, what support will be available for the reintegration of older people into life post-lockdown or shielding, especially as they are scheduled to be vaccinated first? Amy, would you like to start us off on that one?
Yeah, happily. I mean, obviously I've touched on the fact that obviously we're actively transporting people at the minute to get vaccinated, and it's actually giving us a chance to be able to have those conversations with those people, to be able to understand what it is they want when they're coming out of this this current situation. I think a lot of people are still feeling vulnerable, and I think you know, yes, they'll be vaccinated, but feeling vulnerable. A lot of people's confidence has been lost in this last 10 months. And the realization that, you know, we're not going to be going straight back to what was normal this time last year has kind of hit people. But we're looking at ways that you know, how we can engage that, you know, that community. Yes, there's a digital aspect of being able to engage the community in preparation for when people can get back out to the groups and things like that. But the risk with that is that the digital can, to a certain extent, become just as isolating for some people, because it can be, you know, not everybody wants to be doing things via Zoom or anything like that. You know, some people feel that they need that one-to-one, that face-to-face kind of interaction. We've actually had a couple of our lunch clubs have started doing their lunch club meetings where they're delivering the food to the people's houses, and they're all Zooming together, and it's working well, and they're managing to get that engagement in preparation from when they can get back to being face-to-face. And it's lovely to see, you know, we're getting people that are doing fitness classes and doing them online and things like that, and that's wonderful because they're engaging with each other and they're seeing each other. But it will be that transition to be able to safely get people back into what's seen to be normal. How we safely get them there, you know, when, you know, people may be a little bit more frail, it's people's stability's changed because they've been stuck in a house and they've not had the mobility that they've had for quite a long period of time, and it's that investment that's going to have to be put into coming out the other side of it as well. I can't wait to be able to get to a point where we've got people back doing lunch clubs and knitting groups and all the other things, and the gardening groups and the walks and fitness classes. But there's going to be a transitional period that we all have to go through to be able to safely get to that.
Can I just add to that, I mean, Adapt does a lot of community transport in the west and around Morpeth, and we've made lunches through the pandemic, so people for 2 lunch clubs who had to close down, and they've been delivered, and that connection has happened. When the first lockdown ended, and we asked people if they wanted to reconnect back onto the daily rides that they had, and they're right across the west, in Kielder, Slaggyford, Haltwhistle, Allendale, then Morpeth into Belsay, Morpeth into Morpeth, and all that way. Right, there's about 14 of them, and it was quite inspiring actually to see that the old people wanted to go back. Older people, elder people, whatever terminology you want to use, wanted to get back out, and they did, and they got back onto the runs. The vehicles were obviously all well sanitised, COVID secure. The seating arrangements were different. I mean, there were less numbers, so we had to run them slightly differently. But because they had that relationship and they had that trust, they all got back out, and the cafe that reopened, and we had a lot of older people come back there, and it was all COVID secure. So people were keen to come back out and keen to re-engage with their life. This time, I don't know, because I think people were there was a high energy in the first lockdown, and then when we came out of it, there was a bit of energy. It was warmer weather, and people felt as if the virus had been suppressed, and trusted the numbers are really low. And I think this experience of them going really high again in the second lockdown, I'm not sure what that impact will have. We still have people going out on our public, with routes which are public transport routes, and they are still going out and they are still shopping, but they really don't have a lot of choice because there is no other service for them. So it'll be interesting to see, but I think people will come back out. I think it will just maybe take, a little bit of thought around that. But I think if they've got trusted services, they will pick them back up.
We had a slightly different response because we were running an over 50s youth club in just before lockdown, and we had 20-25 people turning up, playing games, listening to music, having coffee and talking mainly, and we talked to them again around September, because that tended to be a winter kind of activity, and said, if we can arrange it in a venue, do you still want to do it? And there was absolute terror. People were saying, no, we're too scared of giving it to somebody else or catching it. And what we actually want to do is, yes, we do want to come together with that kind of thing, and we want to be able to hug the people we were at school with and have grown up with and spent all our lives with, and we can't do that. So I think Liz is right, it's going to be a hard job to get all the kind of the normals back, but I think there might also be a kind of an opportunity to review now whether people actually want to do the same things, or have they explored something different that they might want to do, and starting to plan on that basis. Hope so.
I agree, Jane. It's interesting, we've just sent a survey out to all our volunteers and a number of our users for exactly that, because what worked for everybody 12 months ago is not necessarily what's going to work for them at the end of this. And there'll be certain things that people will have missed particularly, and it may not have been groups that they went to historically, but ones that they want to be able to set up as a result of it. And I think that we've got a responsibility across the county to be able to look at what responding to the individual's needs. So, yeah.
I mean, just a really good one on that is we've got a group of blokes, because one of the questions is about reaching men in our communities, who want to do metal detectoring, if that's the word you use these days. So what we're trying to enable them to do is talk to each other about what the rules and regulations are, because they're quite strict, what kind of kit they've got and what kind of things they'd want to explore. So beginning to almost kind of prepare them for when they can actually get out in the field and make a lot of mess and get muddy.
Who doesn't want to do that?
And again,
so the next question we had is just on mental health. So the mental health services and support feel oversubscribed and are struggling to cope with their waiting lists. Isolation is a huge and increasing problem, especially across rural Northumberland and for older people, particularly men. What would the panel realistically do to help this, please? Just open to anybody, this one.
Oh, we're running a Rural Us scheme. It's a 3-year project that we hope we can extend. It's lottery funded. And it's about reaching hard to reach communities and individuals, and looking, and that's how the metal detectoring things come about. The other thing that was really successful was a men-only coffee morning. It was a real punt by an individual thinking, well, I'll put it on and see if it happens. And they had 23 blokes turned up, and they spent the entire morning talking and having coffee and cake. Then the lockdown happened, but we're quite sure that there is some real capacity for those kinds of activities. And I think that, again, we have to be aware that people with mental health issues have some very specific individual problems, but trying to find some mutual support for them with other people has got to be the way in which we can build sustainable solutions, so that they're kind of self-sustaining. Put a quid in a week and you hire a room, have a cup of coffee and share, and therefore begin to see some help with your situation.
Yeah, I think that mental health is going to be have a huge impact over the coming number of years for older people suffering in isolation, for young children and people with the trauma of losing family members and friends and not being able to either say goodbye or not being able to really sort of follow some of the norms of that ritual, if you like. So I'll stop in a second. And I do think as well that there are differences here between men and women as well. Women have been a lot better than forming and utilising their support networks available to them than men have done. And as they become, as mental health impacts on men, then they will really, and they have struggled because they don't have the same kind of support mechanisms that women have developed and worked on in over a number of years. So I do have a serious concern about mental health right across the spectrum, right across families, right across men and women. But I do feel that it's going to be possibly one of the biggest factors moving forward for the next 10 years.
One person wants to know that one person says they're really interested on how you guys have still engaged with groups that don't have digital access and phones during COVID. Freya, do you want to?
Yeah, so obviously digital access and digital inclusion is something we heavily are involved in. And I've got some key issues and some facts for the listeners as well and for the viewers. So everybody, it gives you a bit of like a reality check. So 9 million people in England, in UK, can't use the internet independently. And this data has been extracted from the Lloyds Bank UK Consumer Digital Index of 2020, which in England, the digital divide is also a north-south divide, which leads us to 49% of people in the southeast are capable of using the internet fully, which is compared to 18% in the northeast and 31% in the northwest. Since March, as we all know, that as we further tiered lockdown and now again we are in lockdown, millions of people are locked out of basic services and support, and which means that they cannot use the internet, locked out of online healthcare, missing their GP appointments, the people who are immigrants, and if they're getting the visas, they do not know how to get their universal credits online. They cannot even write an email, and having stronger passwords with a lot going on onto the online safety. So these are, quite figures, and I've not mentioned them just to just to bring out that there's a lot of digital poverty or digital divide, but I've only mentioned them so we are very much aware that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And in Northeast specifically, as we're all aware, in the rural Northumberland, we work there, and what we've seen is there's hardly any signals. If there is one, Vodafone signals up in a village, if you are trying to reach out to them, there's no other signals that's going to work. And that says a lot in the development of the rural areas and the inequalities that people face. In terms of the devices, people never had the devices when the lockdown happened. That includes the school children, but also the adults. If they do have a device, then they are not aware of how to use that device. There is not data given to them. Wi-Fi is expensive, broadband is expensive. And now with this lockdown, we really have to be aware that if the children are at home, parents are working from home, there's a lot of load on the broadband. It's not going to work, for everybody. So we have to take it in a way. We need to innovate to grow, but at the same time, we need to understand that we should not be asking too much of the people as well. We should leave it to the people on their pace, because I might be very quick in adapting to digital services, but I cannot expect the other people to be on the same level, onto the same pace. So I think here we have to have a bit of like an understanding that there is a big digital divide. It will not be fixed that if we 6 people are deciding, okay, we are going to do that, or if Northumberland decides how to do it. There's a lot of government involvement in it.
So finally, to end the panel on a positive note, one question we had was, in 10 years from now, what positives do you think the county will have learned from COVID?
Ooh. I think we'll have learned to partner organisations, we'll have learned to listen to individuals and our communities, and I think we'll have learned to value volunteers and community much more.
We've learned to collaborate more and to work together through this pandemic, be it with voluntary organisations, other charities, corporates across the county. Ultimately, the collaboration is has allowed us to have the results that we've been able to achieve this year.
I was just going to say, I think what we remember is that individually we're all vulnerable to something that's outside of our control, and that's what COVID has proven. No one is immune from it, so it's changed people's perception on working together, I think, in a way. So hopefully that will be, we'll remember this, but in 10 years time, hopefully we'll all have moved on, and things quickly become the past, don't they? I always sort of think we'll be saying to the grandkids, oh, we lived through a pandemic, things move on. Remember the pandemic? And it'll be a bit like that, won't it?
Let's hope so.
Like, remember winning the World Cup, it'll be remember the pandemic. I mean, it'll be a bit like that, won't it?
I would just like to say one.
Sorry.
No, sorry, you, Tom, you go.
No, please.
Say one line.
No, mine was just a quick about that. We do want to win the World Cup again. We don't want to have a pandemic again. True.
I think one line I would say, in 10 years' time, we would learn and we would know we should work for the people, not to the people. And I think pandemic has made us realize what is enforcement, what is sense of duty, and what is community. And I think whoever has understood these 3 things, there would be new innovation. And as I said earlier, as a community, we are stronger together.
Great. I think that's a wonderful point to close up. So that brings us to the end of our discussion. Although I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. I'd like to say a huge thank you to each of you for giving up your time and participating in this, and thank you to everybody who submitted a question. It's been a fascinating discussion, so thanks very much.
Welcome to a snapshot of new and adapted inclusion activities promoting good mental and physical well-being across our shielded older client groups. The team must be congratulated for ensuring beneficiaries continually feel connected during ever-changing restrictions. Our COVID-19 journey is made remarkable by amazing team adaptability and the astounding 5,000 plus recorded participation numbers being isolated together. This short compilation is testimony to team success.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
I'm County Councillor Richard Dodd, and I want to start by thanking Amy, Farina, Jane, Liz and Tom for that really useful insight into the great work that is going on locally here in Northumberland. It is really reassuring to hear about what is going on and to hear about other avenues that could be explored in tackling loneliness and isolation. As Cabinet Member for Public Health and as Deputy Leader, I'm fortunately engaged in a huge amount of what is going on in our communities to better the health and the well-being of our residents. Now, more than ever before, we have seen people reach out for the help they need, being honest with themselves and others, and as much so seeing people offer their help and support. But like so many others have mentioned today, there are still those who have not sought any help they so very much need. We as a council are committed to tackling loneliness and isolation by working with those who are out there in our communities, who see what is needed and who can help. As we have heard today, there is a vast amount of support out there that can be tapped into, and we must make the best use of that. I want to close by saying a huge thank you to those involved in today's webinar, and I hope you have found it useful and can take something from it. Hearing from Olivia Field and the panel members today is just the first step. We now want to hear your thoughts and perspectives on loneliness and social isolation in Northumberland, and how we can, as a county, continue to build on the great work done by our communities. It would be really helpful if you could all take part in some feedback from today's session by going to our Feeling Connected consultation page at the link that follows this. Thank you very much.
Hello, we are Mortal Fools, a theatre, drama and creative learning company based in Prudhoe, Northumberland. These are our summer projects. 2020 has been an unprecedented time. Being under lockdown with our movement restricted has caused a massive impact. And for young people, this meant an end to school, but not learning. We've had to find new ways of communicating, creating new skills, seeking out new adapted ways to gain experience.
Mortal Fools was the place where we connected with like-minded people, teaching us how to work together and create theatre before lockdown, and they've adapted to continue this during lockdown. Young people need mediums like this during these times, to be able to connect to other people, make theatre that means something to us, have a routine and have a good laugh. Here, we document the journey of finding a new normal for our theatre company, starting with a few faulty Zoom calls. Have we lost you?
What? Oh, I can't hear you, like, your screen's gone a bit frozen, like.
The magic of theatre is its connection. The interactions between the cast, the directors, sound and lighting team, and most of all the audience. COVID-19 forced us to adapt, so that we had to connect online, play theatre games on Zoom, do a warm-up on mute, wake up, get online, free write, devise, then rehearse and repeat.
During the spring and summer of 2020, Company 3 organised an online coronavirus time capsule. Mortal Fools, alongside 215 theatre groups, contributed video content to this, all created and produced by young people. Every week, a theme would be announced. We would discuss and generate content ideas from it in our Zoom calls. This year, the Time Capsule project took up 10 weeks of our quarantine, allowing for us to be creative and have an outlet in these stressful times. The Time Capsule reflects the change and growth young people have internationally faced through the medium of video content.
Just head straight to the Company 3 website or type in Coronavirus Time Capsule Company 3 and it will direct you straight there to watch video compilations of young people talking about their experiences and perspectives of this time. When the World is Loud is an audio theatre experience based on our time in lockdown, from finding an escape to thoughts about the future. On August 27th, 2020, all 3 groups of our youth theatre united, socially distanced, to experience the audio walk Mortal Fools devised and created during lockdown. From the ideas of our teenage ensemble group to the younger Stage 3, this project was built to give listeners a whole new perspective on young people's lockdown lives. Feel free to check out this audio walk. You can just go straight to our website, and on the homepage we have provided direct links to where you can listen to it, whether it's via Podbean, Spotify or straight from the website. You can also check out our Instagram at Mortal Fools UK, where we regularly update it with our youth theatre projects and other company events.
Creative companies hold such an importance to livelihoods and mental health of young people. Providing an outlet during these isolating and confusing times can be essential. The word isolation means to be alone, and Mortal Fools have helped many of us escape that feeling by having us stay connected online and off. The Company 3 time capsule has allowed for thousands of young people to reach out and channel their thoughts and feelings into a project that will forever be online. When the World is Loud expresses our thoughts as a company, condensing them down into a podcast for listeners anywhere.
Giving young people a platform to speak out and give their perspectives to an audience is empowering and important and shouldn't be neglected. This is, in a sense, a call to action to any creative companies working to give young people a platform and a voice to speak on their own behalves. What makes them laugh? What makes them angry? What is challenging them? Creative companies are a vital source to help us answer these questions. And it makes you wonder, what could we do next?